In this lecture, we will take up Proverbs chapter 4, verses 10 to 19. In the overview of chapters 4 through 9, which you see before you, you can tell that this represents poem number 2, which is the first in 3 poems that comprise cycle 1. We're entitling it, "Cling to the Route of Discipline by Exiting the Route of the Guilty." In this poem, by using the motif of travel, the lecture makes it clear that the youth has taken the wrong road in life. For reasons undisclosed, he is now moving further and further along the path of ethical values and choices consistent with the guilty. Aware of this route's dark and damaging end, the sage fashions this particular lecture as a disciplinary intervention. Notice verse 13a. It is calculated to dislodge the youth from his current trajectory. As a result of this reprimand, the youth should begin traveling the ever brighter way of wisdom. Let's look back for a moment to the preceding context. Leading up to this point, the father sage has presented an extensive case for wisdom, Proverbs 1 and 2, which he then followed with a foundational lesson on divine and human relationships. That was Proverbs 3. Thereupon, the father sage began to transmit legacy wisdom. He introduced the grandfather figure by recalling what that senior sage used to say to him back when he was himself a child. Not surprisingly, the earliest of the grandfather's lessons that he could remember or chose to relay constituted a wisdom commendation, which we've entitled, "Above All Else, Acquire Wisdom." That spanned Proverbs 4, 1 through 9. What about the context that will follow after this poem? Following the reprimand theme that characterizes this poem, chapter 4, verses 10 to 19, in the next poem, the sage will describe in concrete terms what it means to travel the route of wisdom. That will be chapter 4, 20 through 27. He expresses this quite concretely, portraying how various body parts must conduct themselves if behaving wisely. Consequently, that poem represents the body behavior theme. A lecture spanning all of Proverbs chapter 5 concerning the influential women theme comprises the next poem, number 4. Poems 2, 3, and 4 together comprise cycle 1, since they present the same 3 themes that will reappear in cycle 2, that is Proverbs 6, 7, and 8, and they present them in the same sequence. Let's now turn to the translation that's provided and read through it. Beginning with chapter 4, verse 10. "Listen, my son, and take my words, so they may multiply for you years of life. In the way of wisdom I have instructed you. I have made you travel in honest tracks. As you walk, your step would not be hampered, and if you run, you would not be tripped. Take hold of discipline. Don't let her go. Protect her, for she is your life. Along the path of guilty folk do not set out, and do not stride along the way of the wicked. Let it go. Go no further along it. Get off it and move along. For they cannot sleep unless they have inflicted hurt. Their slumber is stripped away unless they trip. For they have feasted on food of guilt, and wine of violence they will go on drinking. Yet the path of moral folk is as the dawning of a bright light shining progressively brighter until daylight has become well established. The way of the guilty is like the darkness. They don't know what they may trip over. As you can see from the outline suggested on the right, this poem consists of an initial summons. That's simply verse 10 alone, which then is tagged as section 1. And this in turn is followed by 3 additional sections. In section 2, that spans verses 11 and 12, the grandfather sage rehearses the fact that in some past time he has already transmitted wise instruction to his son. Since that advice went unheeded, in section 3 the grandfather renews and intensifies his counsel. That spans verses 13 through 17. He concludes his lesson by painting the binary alternatives confronting the youth in stark contrast, using a character summary, and that is section 4, verses 18 and 19. Let's focus first on those structures that indicate a relationship between one section and another. First, among macrostructural features, then, we can observe 2 separate summonses, one in section 1 and another in section 3. Now, to encounter a summons at the outset of a lesson is no surprise. We're referring now to verse 10, which opens the entire poem and is a summons. However, when a second summons appears in the middle of a lesson, it should raise questions. And now we're referring to verse 13, which opens section 3. Why is a second summons needed? By requiring a second summons, the grandfather signals the fact that admonitions delivered to the youth in the past, we're referring to section 2, 11 and 12, these have fallen on deaf ears. So now he launches a fresh summons as preface to a fresh but related lesson. Also significant is the shift in the wisdom commodity that the sage names in his 2 separate summons. In the initial whole lesson summons of verse 10, he directs the youth simply to receive his words, to take his words. This represents a very neutral picture of receptivity in 10a. In contrast, when gearing up to deliver a higher volume escalation of his teaching, he directs the youth to take hold, not simply take, but take hold. And now, not take hold of words, but take hold of discipline. Both of these expressions create an intensification over the summons in verse 10. In particular, the term discipline that we see in verse 13 connotes reprimand, an indication that the youth has ignored earlier counsel and so now requires a sterner form of intervention. Next, consider the macrostructure that arises from the theme of travel. This is attested in sections 2, 3, and 4. Here are some of the terms that are belonging to this group: way, travel, tracks, walk, step, run, to trip, path, to stride, to go further, and to get on your way. Another macrostructure has to do with the time contrast that links section 2 and section 3. Both sections 2 and 3 describe the transmission of wisdom instructions. The contrast that links these has to do with time, that is, when it was in the youth's life that the 2 instructions were transmitted. The instruction of section 2 was transmitted to him in the past. He refused to heed that instruction, evident from the fact that he is now traveling the wrong path. Consequently, the sage now transmits wisdom again, but in the present, through imperatives, and that constitutes section 3, especially verses 13 through 16. The last macrostructure has to do with closure, and not surprisingly, this is located in the last section, section 4. The terms guilty folk, way, and to trip contribute to closure when they recur in that final verse, verse 19. Guilty folk appeared earlier in verse 14. In addition, the noun guilt also occurred in verse 17. And as we observed earlier, way occurred earlier in the poem, verses 11 and 14. Trip is line terminal in each of its uses. The end of verse 12, the end of verse 16, and here the end of verse 19. As a result, it adds a syntactic layer to the closural effect already produced by simple repetition. Now let's turn our attention to microstructural features. First, past time coherence within section 2. Through the statements, quote, I have instructed you, end quote, and quote, I have made you travel, end quote, in verse 11, the sage establishes a time frame of events set in the past. That time frame colors the rationale presented in verse 12 as also belonging to the past. Your step would not be hampered, and you would not be tripped. Next, a microstructure involving present time coherence then in section 3. By the use of command forms, which by definition are anchored in the present, the sage establishes a present time coherence within section 3. He implies no less than 9 such expressions in the first 2 blocks of section 3, that is, verses 13, 14, and 15. Another microstructural feature arises with the admonition that is buttressed by a rationale within section 3. The sage supports 2 verses of admonition, that is, verses 14 and 15, by a rationale. In fact, the rationale is similarly 2 verses in length, verses 16 and 17. The admonition is to get off a certain path. The rationale is because that path is traveled by people who practice violence. In fact, they are addicted to violence. The last microstructural feature involves coherence surrounding both form and content in section 4, that is, verses 18 and 19. As regards form, the verses comprising section 4 cohere in the fact that they comprise a character summary conclusion. What we mean by that is, regardless the specific content, as we analyze its message, we see at least one character, if not 2, in this case 2 contrasting characters, that are set forth, and they form a summary of the teaching that has been presented to this point. The notion of illumination provides coherence at the content level. What we mean by that is the specific message that is conveyed here has to do with the topic or the metaphor of illumination. We can see this in several terms, such as dawning, bright light, shining progressively brighter, daylight, and the antonym, darkness, together with the consequence of traveling in darkness, which is to unwittingly trip over obstacles. So in these ways, we find microstructural development or cohesion in particular parts of this poem. What lessons can we draw from this poem as we come to a close? In poem number 1, that is, in this grandfather legacy wisdom that began in chapter 4, verse 1, we there heard the grandfather issue a clarion call urging the youth to rank wisdom as the premier acquisition after which he must quest. In essence, if he fails to acquire wisdom, both as commodity and as companion, then no other gain will hold lasting worth. As we listen closely to the tone of the verbs here in poem number 2, that is beginning with Proverbs 4:10, it becomes clear that something has gone terribly wrong. Instead of following the wisdom way, once given the opportunity to choose for himself, the youth opted for guilty folk as traveling companions. Sadly, evil doing feeds and fuels these people. But the long look reveals that the evil they suppose they perpetrate against others actually will damage themselves. Notice chapter 4, verses 16b and 19. It is important to note the grandfather's reaction at this point once he becomes aware of his son's hazardous choice of friends. He refuses to rest content, reassuring himself, "I taught him once, now it's up to him to choose which way he will go." Instead, the grandfather sage cares enough about his son to re-engage the subject matter, escalating intensity to the level of a reprimand. And therein lies the core of this poem. Reprimand, wrapped in the journey motif, delivered to his son in hopes that he will wake up and recover from traveling his mistaken path. 3 additional strategies employed by the grandfather may prove instructive. First, when seeking to persuade the youth of the wrongness of his present path, the grandfather does not castigate or blame. Instead, he issues crisp, clear directions detailing what the youth now must do. Go no further on this route. Get off it. Go on your way. Also, he buttresses the case against traveling the path of the guilty by describing not the youth himself, but by describing those fellow travelers who consider that hazardous route their natural path. As the youth hears of their sleep-deprived addiction to violence, he would more easily make the connection that neither is he like them, nor does he wish to become like them. All the more reason to exit from their route. Second, in the grandfather's thinking, the converse of wisdom is not simply foolishness, but moral failure. The alternative to wisdom's way is not the way of fools, but of the guilty. Notice verse 14. At the poem's conclusion, where we expect the sage climactically to announce wisdom as the preferred path, instead he showcases the path of moral folk. Verse 18. Wisdom leads to success because it is moral. Absent morality, there can only be failure. Third, the grandfather motivates the youth to change by portraying eventual outcomes. This appears most poignantly in the conclusion, which is a character summary. For the righteous, life will grow steadily brighter until it reaches a zenith. For the guilty, futile darkness falls until they are tripped up in their travel and clueless to understand why. Periodically, it may be helpful to observe elements of the sage's teaching back at the outset in Proverbs 1, 2, and 3, elements from that portion which now resemble the grandfather's teaching. 3 features here in poem number 2 illuminate elements found earlier in the book, similarities which may help us better grasp how they functioned in the previous poems. First, the grandfather's competing journeys here in poem 2 may illuminate why the father chose to open his teaching with the 2 competing invitations, that is, the appeal of wealth and the appeal of wisdom, both in chapter 1. Second, the specific prohibition, do not go, that is, do not go in the path of the guilty, chapter 4, verse 14, resembles closely the father's warning in an earlier poem, where we find in chapter 1, verse 14, do not go along the way with them. That was a pivotal statement there in chapter 1. And finally, to close with a character summary, as does poem 2 here. This is a device that occurs 4 times across Proverbs 1 through 3, of which the last 3 contrast both a positive character and a negative character, just as happens here in chapter 4, verses 18 and 19.